Well, thanks so much, Lori, for coming back on again on Investment Masterminds and talking with our audience. And we spoke in early October. And when I talked to you the last time, oh, by the way, what do you think of my sweater? What do you think of the
Oh,
sweater?
your sweater's very colorful. It's
So,
coming through
have you
gray
ever
here.
been have you ever been on social media and like it pops up with something that looks like really cool and then you buy it and it's not exactly what you thought it was? So I got
That
this
would be.
sweater and people keep on saying, "Oh, it's ugly sweater season." And I'm like, I'm really insulted by that because I thought it looked really nice. But actually the
It's
first
got
person
a 70s vibe. It's got like a 70s vibe, I
totally.
think.
Yeah, it's got like all these
Yeah.
colors on it. And
Oh,
it's
wow.
so I
Oh,
put it on
wow.
and so I put it on and I'm like, the sizing seems wrong and the buttons are on the wrong side. And my wife says, "That's a woman's sweater." And I said, "No, it's not. No, it's not. It looks good." So now I'm kind of wearing it just out of spite. I'm just like, no, I'm just gonna wear it because I like it and it's cozy and it's winter up here.
You remind me of a quick story when we always have had dogs, and we went up and picked out a puppy. This was 3 dogs ago, and he was a boy and he was super cute. And then my husband went up to get the dog. It was in Cleveland at a kennel, and he went up to get the dog when the dog was 8 weeks old, and he came back home with the dog. He had one of my sons with him, and I looked at the dog. I picked the dog up,
Something's
examined
missing.
it, and said, "This is a girl dog." And he said, "No, it's not. This is a boy." And 2 minutes later, we got a call from the kennel. "We gave you the wrong dog." So we ended up keeping that dog
Oh, no.
anyway and renaming her Bella. And she was a terror. But
Oh
anyway,
no.
so funny. He was like, "No, this is definitely a boy."
That's one argument that I'm sure you won because it
Yes.
anatomically you're gonna win that.
It was just funny. It was like within minutes, and he drove all the way from Cleveland to Rochester with the wrong dog. And the only resemblance, because they were both cute, was we picked out a dog with a cowlick, and the dog had a cowlick. It just was a girl.
Yeah.
So
Oh
anyway,
no way. That's funny.
I
Well,
have a
I
lot
hope.
of funny stories about my husband like that. But yeah,
Well, I don't feel as bad about having the sweater on, which I think
the
is
woman's
still.
sweater.
I think it's a man's sweater, but European,
Yeah, it's very European,
very European.
70s looking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when we talked last October, or this October, early October, the book was just starting to get some momentum, and then now I see it's all over the place. It's a Wall Street Journal bestseller, and I just saw that you were on the top 11 books for the season to read and to gift. I thought that was really cool. I saw that recently, so congratulations on that success. So, can you
Thank
tell me
you.
a little bit about the journey, since we last talked?
Yeah, so we talked in October right after I published the book. And, my goal was never, to replace my day job being an author. That wasn't the point of the book. But I'm gratified that people like the book, that it's helping people, that maybe it's inspiring people. If you go out on Amazon and read the reviews, I just feel very grateful that it resonates across. When you write a book, publishers, I independently published this book, but marketers, people around you are always asking you, who's your audience? That's like the first question you get. And when I started writing this book, long story short, I didn't really have a specific audience in mind. Just thought it might be helpful, inspirational, if some of the things that have happened in my life could help someone get through the next day, the next hour. Um, Part of my advice or the wisdom that was learned would have an impact. That was kind of across a universal thing. But ultimately, I was kind of coached by both people that read it, beta readers, that it was a great book for young women or women in transition, career life balance kind of book. But if you read the reviews, they're all over the place. They're younger, older, men, women, different people from all different backgrounds. So I think that that's what I'm most gratified about, that it seems to be hitting the mark for a lot of people. So that's great. Yeah. And the only marketing around it has been that I finally, after I published, hired a publicist, which is totally backwards. People don't do that. Usually you do that long before you publish a book. But my goal, I'm not a professional author. My goal again wasn't like this is my occupation, but I just decided I wanted to write the book. I never really got to the point where I said I'm going to publish this until June of this year, and it took 3 years to write. So I thought the worst case was it would be a book for my children. So now I do have a publicist, and I am scheduled to be on a bunch of podcasts that are pretty notable, which will be fun. I love to publicly speak. I love doing this kind of thing. So that will be fun. And there's a bunch of media outlets that have kind of picked up interviews and things like that that are out there. So it's fun it's fun, and it's also gratifying.
Yeah, and I really appreciated it when we first talked and you were kind of on a run and you said, "Yeah, call me right now," and we got have like 10 minutes or whatever it is. And
Right.
I thought that was just such a nice thing, and so glad that I've at least peripherally been in this journey a little bit with you. So I really appreciate that. And for those of you out there that haven't read the book, I mean, it's really just it really is a great story in so many different ways. And I say story, it's your story, but you are a twin raised by a single mother in Rochester, New York, and you ultimately became eventually one of the most successful financial advisors in the world. How do you get from A to B? That just doesn't seem like it makes too much sense on paper, right?
Yeah, no. Well, I had a great upbringing, and people who thought outside of the box and coached and mentored me as a child. And I really do credit a lot of whatever success I've had and resiliency for sure with that. My mom was, as you mentioned, a divorced mother when my brother and I were a year old, about somewhere around there, and we never knew our father. So our my mother's father stepped in as our father figure, and he was great. And he was just a man who didn't see gender, he didn't see boxes, he didn't see limits in terms of my brother and I. And I think he played to our strengths. Like, he exposed me really early to a lot of different things, including at 7. I write about this, and I've talked about it before. I mean, I believe it was at 7 or younger, sitting at a kitchen table where he would make lunch and show me an annual report of a company and say, "What do you think of this company? I'm thinking of investing in it." And we didn't come from any money. He was like this small business kind of self-made guy, but it wasn't like we came from a lot of money. We went from lower middle class to maybe middle class by the time I was in college. And I was the first person to go to college in my family. My mom didn't go. My grandfather had and grandmother had 8th grade educations. So my brother and I went to college, and then I graduated from college and went to Harvard University as a graduate student, and got a master's of education. And so my path, as you point out, and I talk about it in the book, and some of my early childhood and background, was not a straight path to finance, but I was certainly influenced by, particularly by my grandfather. Like I say in the book, like when I landed at Lehman Brothers, I was hired by Lehman Brothers. Shearson Lehman Brothers was the side that I ended up working in. I started in the World Trade Center. I looked around. I had no idea that I was different, but I was kind of curious about the fact that I was one of 2 women in the room. And I just thought, wow, this is odd. I wonder why this is. But it wasn't like I thought, oh, I don't belong here, or I wasn't intimidated by it. I just thought, wow, and so he was a guy who just didn't think in limits, and didn't think because you were a woman or whatever. He just encouraged me and gave me a lot of different experiences as a child and a young adult. And I really do credit him, as well as my mom, who was a working mother and a wonderful human, and my grandmother. She was more of a your traditional mother figure. So I feel like I had 3 good parents instead of 2 or
Yeah.
1.
And your mother's side was Italian. Is it Italian? Was that right? Yeah.
Yeah, my mom was Italian. My father, I talk about my heritage in the book a little bit, but I'm, a Van Dusen, which the roots are Van Dusen of New Amsterdam roots, but I never knew my father. So I have a chapter that talks about you're much more than your DNA. So you'll have to have people read it to get into that. But a lot of it is, you can look at someone's circumstances and say, gee, they, didn't really come from much. They didn't have connections. They didn't know anything about finance. How did they end up doing this? And I think it's like a story, the book is kind of a story about we set our own limits, I think, where people can try to put limits on us. And it's what, we do with that matters. And I think it was really formative when I was a child to be taught not to think that way. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. And my mother's side of the family is all Italian, and they've always stuck together as a family. It's a very, it's a great network to grow up in, even though it was a difficult time for you. At least your mom, being a single mom and all those things, but it's great you had that network to build off of. Certainly.
Yeah, it was a very loving foundation. And, I think I've had conversations with friends of mine, and I have a lot of male friends growing up in this business, and they would have said things to me like, wow, you had such a great upbringing, and I wish I would have had an upbringing like that or whatever. And I think another message in the book is you can't, kind of wish for things or regret things or spend a lot of time, in the past. You have to, the cards you're dealt are the cards you're dealt, and then you have to do the best you can with them. And, my kind of retort to that, if there is one, is that I was a female in 1987 on Wall Street, and it wasn't like anybody gave me a fruit basket or a welcome party, so I think, yes, it was really wonderful that I grew up the way I grew up, with an open mind and a clean sheet of paper, and not thinking that I couldn't do something just because I was a woman or I didn't come from a network. I showed up at Harvard and people would say to me, repeatedly, like, who went here? Why are you here? It's like nobody, So I think, we all are dealt different hands. We all have different gifts. We all have different strengths and weaknesses. And it's what we do to optimize those. And I think ultimately give back that is the most worthwhile thing, in life. And that's a lot about, kind of some of the stories in the book weave that theme kind of throughout.
Yeah. And so you had mentioned you were one of two women at Shearson Lehman and as brokers, right? As basically,
yeah, we were called brokers back then. It's like get on the phone and sell stock or sell a mutual fund or something. Yeah.
And so in the book, and those of you out there, you need to read the book. It is amazing, and and not just for me. My wife works for National Geographic, and she read the book and she said the same thing. But just the thought of everybody's selling stocks and you decided to do something different, right? And what was that thought process there?
Well, I will say when I first got to the World Trade Center and into the training program, I looked around and I thought, is this really? I don't know anything. First of all, that was my first thought, is I don't know anything. So if I was intimidated by anything, it was probably my own lack of experience and no formal degree in finance. And I talk about imposter syndrome and how I suffered from some of these things when I was younger. But one thing I knew for sure is that I had had enough experiences by the time I entered that training program at the top of World Trade Center, that I knew how to talk with people. I knew how to get at real problems and solve problems. And I thought that the business model was frankly stupid. Like I didn't think it was right. It was stupid and it wasn't right. The stupid part is, why were people, and it wasn't just the trainees in my training program, it was the whole how Wall Street worked. If you were a broker, there's no advising. It was, you're a broker, you get on the phone, you call a bunch of people, you sell a product, and then you do it all over again every day, not understanding anything that the person was struggling with, what the pre-existing investments were. There was no financial planning going on. I could go on and on, but I kept thinking, like, that's the stupid part and the part that's not right. Like, how do I sell something to someone without understanding a thing about them or what they already have or what they're struggling with or what their time horizon is, their risk tolerance, all the things that we now know are basic financial planning did not exist back then. was just people getting on the phone and selling what was sexy, or, you know, the latest, you know, greatest company that was going to make, you know, people really did back then just play on a lot of, I think, you know, human emotion around making money and greed, and, you know, I don't know. And I just thought it was dumb and wrong. And so I just said, I'm not doing this. I'm going to just have conversations with people, and I'm going to ask them about their situation. I'm going to ask them about the problems they've been having, what their investments look like now, what they've done in terms of financial planning, which didn't exist back then, estate planning. And then I'm going to just close the phone call, assuming they didn't hang up on me, which they hung up on me a lot. But I'm going to close the phone call with a meeting. I'm just going to tell the person I'll be in your area on January 5th. Would it be okay if I stopped by and met you in person? And if I got that far, almost 100% of the time they said yes. And then I knew if I got in the room with someone, that my whole goal was to just understand, and understanding builds trust. And then ultimately I would bring in assets. So my focus wasn't on selling products. It was on, if you will, gathering assets, and really basically solving problems. And that just was very revolutionary and not well accepted back then, but it worked. It worked.
And this was
So
in the
I created
the 80s, right? Yeah.
Well, I started in my training class was, I think it was July of 86. My first full year, you know, out of the training program was 1987. Yeah, and I was there when, you know, Black Monday occurred. I was in New York. I you know, heard everybody screaming over squawk boxes and witnessed all that, and I had no business. You know, I was just a trainee, but I leaned over and said to someone, "Does this always happen?" You know, I had no idea that this was a really unusual event, you know. And there was a lot of loss back then. There were people that were really suffering financially, but I just didn't have any context for it because I was a trainee. But yeah, so it was 1987 was my first full year. It was Shearson Lehman Brothers, which ultimately became Smith Barney. And right before the Morgan Stanley merger, I left to go independent. So I was there a long time. I was there 20 years, and I was, you know, at the top of the advisory, you know, industry in terms of, you know, all the metrics that they use. It's not qualitative, but in terms of production and revenue and assets and that kind of thing. And that was a great thing for me because, and I talk a little bit about work life. Well, I talk a lot about work life balance, but I do feel that this career was a blessing for me, having children, being a parent, because the numbers protected me. If I was delivering the numbers, for the most part, nobody asked me where I was at 3:00 when I was getting the boys off the bus or whatever. So it ended up being, you know, in a lot of ways, weirdly, a much easier path for being a mom and being a professional than if I were in management, where I had to be, you know, sitting at a desk or be accountable every, you know, during, 8 to 5 or whatever. So.
Yeah, I know we talked about this before, but, you know, you think about the 80s and the movies that glamorize sales, you know, like Glengarry, Glen Ross, and Tin Men, and of course Wall Street, right? And, you know, that behavior,
right?
You know, all those movies ended poorly, right? But the lessons,
they all ended poorly. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember when I was starting the business in the 90s, people were still replicating that behavior because they idolized it. They idolized Gordon Gekko, and like, he went to jail. Right. But I mean, at the time, I didn't have any perspective of it, but it's amazing to see that over and over again. We see these same stories, the same mistakes, but it took someone that was kind of an outsider to come in and really do the right thing, and that's what really made you successful. And I love that about your story. And you started to write this book years ago, but I think you told me that you actually just kind of like trashed it. You said, "I'm not going to do this," or "I'm going to redo it," and then started again, right? Is that kind of accurate? Yeah.
Yeah, it started. It's so funny that you say that, because this morning, a really close friend of mine who wrote a review, the first review for the book, was kind of I would say it's my sounding board. I trust him, and he is a very well-read person, has very diverse views, and he sent me a voice memo this morning from 2019 of me talking about the book and reading a chapter of it and saying, this is awful, I have to redo this. He said, look at how far you've come. But I started before that, and then it was more of a business book. It never was going to be a memoir or a, you know, I thought, who cares about that? And it just kind of, I threw it out when my husband died suddenly in June of 2020. And I was not in my right mind. I wasn't able to write. Somehow, maybe 3 months later, I started to journal. It might have been sooner, but I think it was about 3 months later, I just started to journal. And memory and the mind is really a amazing thing, because I'm sure some of what I had written earlier kind of was repurposed, but the whole goal of the book was completely different. It was really to share a lot of the things that I've gone through, especially the failures and losses, because none of us escape them. We might try, but none of us do. And I think it was more of a book about how do I encourage people, and how do I somehow teach people from my point of view that suffering is not a senseless mystery. We all go through it. We all, have trials and all kinds of things that happen in life that shape us. And I started to like just think about this, and went through and started writing and journaling, and would go out for a run and journal some more and listen to something, and it just took shape. I can't even tell you. I think sometimes it was in a way otherworldly. Like I would just wake up and think, okay, I need to write about that. And going back in time is a really interesting thing. And when Ron died, it was the first time in my life I'd ever gone to therapy. And I would encourage people to do it if they're struggling in any way. Or I just thought, I have tools in my toolbox, but when he died, I didn't have enough tools to deal with it. And I had to go through that process, go back in time a lot and resurrect certain things. And that was really helpful to me in healing. Journaling was helpful, and in writing the book and having it take shape. So since you've read it, it's not a business book. There are business stories in it, but it's really not a business book. So it just kind of took a different shape. And I think it's more of a book to help people go through transitions, go through loss, go through the things that we navigate in life, and realize that there is a purpose. We might not understand it, and we certainly never understand it at the time. Something really awful happens. But as I've moved through and as I have been healing, I realize that I'm a deeper person than I was before. I can empathize with people in a different way. I understand, for example, when someone has lost a spouse or a longtime partner or a mother or a father, or God forbid, a child, I feel that I can, say and support better, say things and support in a better way, because I've been through some of these things. So I think the book, just took shape very, very differently because of the losses that I experienced. I lost my mother in January, as you know, and she was my best friend, and she worked in my business for 25 years. She was my assistant. And I feel very lost some days without my mother as an assistant. Like, it's so sad, because I didn't know how to make any kind of travel arrangements. She did everything. And that was sudden. She died in 2 days. I mean, it was very fast. And people say, well, that's a blessing, and it certainly is. We're all going to die, and it's a blessing, but it's super hard to be on the other side of it. So I write about these kinds of things because people who have experienced business failures like I have, people look at my life and say, well, wow, you've had this successful career, and you're at the top of the finance industry, or whatever it is that people think. There's a friend of mine calls it the iceberg illusion. There's this, thing that you see, and then there's all this stuff underneath. And so what I try to do in the book is unpack a lot of that stuff, and how, if you let it, life can help you evolve and find peace and purpose if you allow it, you know. But you have to move through these things, and that's kind of the kind of it in a nutshell.
Yeah.
What happened with the book.
Yeah. Well, after you got done writing it, like, did you actually reread it, like, or read through it, or did you just kind of give it to the publisher and say, like, this is it? Because that must have been an interesting experience, like, of
That's a good
making this
question
piece. And
too. Yeah, well, it was like I jumped off a cliff. I didn't reread it. What I did was, and I would advise anybody writing a book to do this. First of all, writing a book, yeah, I have so much appreciation for authors because it was so hard. And you have to have, well, I wrote it and self-published it. I had a great editor, great editing team, including my son, my younger son. So when you're editing, you're kind of reading bits and pieces and going back, and you're never reading the whole thing. You
yeah,
know, you're kind of keep going through this progress. And I don't know, I could tell you I know there were well over 100 drafts. I don't know how many, but lots of drafts. But then the most important thing for me beyond that was to have beta readers, people that were very different from each other, didn't know each other, came from different kind of walks of life, read the book and tell me what they thought. And that was great too, because you'd have someone say, I didn't quite understand this, because, you know, there are business stories and there is kind of jargon in our business. And I've always tried to avoid jargon, but it's still, some of these stories are more complicated. There's other stories about some of the, there's a big story about politics in there, and trying to get it to a point where anybody, no matter how much financial experience they have or experience on philanthropic boards or politics, anybody could read it and understand it and take something significant away. That was really the test for me, and why I wanted to have beta readers and people. And that was a little scary because I had to literally take a manuscript and hand it to somebody to read. And it has, as you know, it's a very personal book. I'm a very private person who put a public story out there. And people also think you're public because you've done this, you've done that. I Googled you, I see you, and I see all this stuff. But still, I'm an intensely private person. And I decided that maybe it was a mission or purpose to write the book to help other people. That, again, I didn't just go through all this to mark time. And finally, what happened was someone that I trust immensely, who is also, you know, all he does is read. And he's not somebody that watches any kind of anything, you know, and he doesn't know anything about popular culture. He just reads. So he said to me, and he has a 21-year-old daughter and 3 sons, and he said, Lori, you need to publish this book. I think it's going to help a lot of people. And that was when I just decided to jump off the cliff. And I never reread the whole book until a couple weeks ago, when I actually did the Audible portion. I have done the book on audio, and it should be out. It takes a couple weeks to be mastered and whatever else happens to it. But that'll be out. But that's a very, very interesting experience to read
wow,
a book, to narrate it. Yeah. So
yeah,
that was the first time that I read the whole book after all the editing and everything.
wow, that must have been surreal. I would think,
Yeah.
just like almost reading someone else's story like that.
Yeah, it's hard to do. I have an appreciation for, you know, a lot of people hire professionals to
Yeah,
read books. There's a whole career around that. But I went into a sound studio. I had a producer in New York and a local sound studio down where I am right now in Southwest Florida, and sat there for 3 days in that studio and did it. And it's different from doing this. It's different from public speaking, which I've done a lot of. It's just different, you know. So you get a little bit of coaching and then you go. And I had heard from other people that were in the industry and in book publishing and media, this is a bear. Like, you should really hire someone to do this. And I'm like, no, I think I could do this. And I did it. and I felt it should be in my voice. I didn't think it should be in someone else's voice because it is an intensely personal book, but it is a different experience to narrate a book versus doing something like this, or standing up in front of a group of people and giving a speech, or having a conversation. So
Yeah,
yeah.
I agree with something. So it is a very personal, very transparent look at your life, and I think that would be really hard to hear someone else just read your words. I think,
Yeah.
so I give you a lot of credit for doing that and going through that process. You feel, I mean, you talk a lot about helping other people. Do you feel that writing the book was also therapeutic for yourself and helpful?
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, I think it absolutely helped with healing. And I think the hardest thing for me, there were two chapters in the book that I was stuck on. And one of them was my experience at Harvard, and the other one was my husband's death. And when I finally got to the point where I could write in a very open way, completely transparent way, and I knew both of the stories were, they just felt right and peaceful. That's when I also knew I could publish. But that was healing. In terms of healing, those were turning points for me, because the story that and I think I know, what I'm talking about. People will have to read it, but the Harvard chapter was really rough to write. And I never talked about any of that, even with my family. And when I wrote it, it's crazy. As I said, your memory is crazy. And I put things together after I wrote that chapter that I had never in years put together. Like, and so from a healing perspective, it was really great to be able to put it in words, and put it in words in a way that I was peaceful with. I was peaceful releasing it out into the universe, but also I knew for sure that that chapter would help people, and the chapter on Ron, my husband's death, would help people. So yeah, for sure, it was healing.
Well, I appreciate everything that you've kind of gone through and helping other people to at least feel they're not alone in those experiences. And I think, the book itself is, I recommend it to anybody, not only someone that's experienced loss, not only somebody that's in finance, but just people that love to hear the stories of other people, right? And everybody has their own pain that they have to go through in different times of their lives, and some of that is right in your face, like you've kind of realized more recently, and sometimes it's a slower drip for other people. But it definitely has influenced me in a lot of ways, in just being more thankful for the people around me, and not taking that for granted, and I've been fortunate enough not to have huge losses in my life, but it did also resonate with me, so I think you did a great job of just telling a great story about, all those things that you've been through, but in a positive message too. It's not a book that I felt like
Right.
I was sad through. I found it interesting, and then it had these events that occurred and how you got through them, which I thought was really just amazing. So I really appreciate it. So just switching gears before, I know you have a limited time today. Can you tell us a little bit about your firm? So
Sure.
LVW Advisors, and you're in New York, and you're also in New York City, upstate New York. Now you're in Florida today. So, how has that progressed? You went independent years ago. You went through a lot to get there and get to this point. And
Yeah.
kind of what's your vision?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because LVW, again, write about it in the book, so we won't, take all this time to go through it. But LVW is an independent RIA. But I'm a person, as I've said, with a what we call a wirehouse background. And I've learned a lot of lessons in my life, and you're right, the book is about those lessons and helping or inspiring people. But I've also had a lot of career successes and also failures, and I write about the failures. And one of the things that I've learned is that being early is the same as being wrong, pretty much. And I had this vision that in, I think, it probably started in 2005, where I thought this business is going independent. It's going to go to the independent channel. It's going to be a huge thing. And I really want to have this kind of open platform, open architecture technology that is all about the client. All, kind of what we know today as, and this is no slam against any of the large banks and advisors there. It's just that I was frustrated and I had hit the limits of where I was. So I was thinking about leaving long before I did. So by the time I left, I thought I was late. And so ultimately I left in 2008, and August 31st, 2008, and ultimately then formed LVW. And I talk about that in the book, and realized I was very early. And we were one of the first and the largest, according at least to the Financial Times, the largest practice, I'll call us a practice, to leave a wirehouse and go independent. And at the time that I went independent, we were a $5.5 billion AUM with a desk and a phone, practice, but with great people. And my goal was to create a next gen team and a business. A long time ago, I read a book that stuck with me, and it was about how you create an enterprise, and you have to take yourself out of it. And how do you create process and mentor people? So I feel that LVW now is at a place where it could extend beyond the founder. And that has a lot to do with professional management, great clients, great people, great next gen team. And just, as somebody who started the firm, it's something that I always wanted to see, that I have it's a very young firm, we have people who are advisors who started with me or with us when they were interns. So they're 40 years old now, or 42, that's a lot of experience for a relatively young person. So we have next gen leadership. I feel that we're in a really good spot. And my whole goal with LVW is to continue to get to the point where I do joke about this a lot, that I'm totally useless overhead. But I do think, I can see that happening, and I really am fortunate that way. I have really wonderful people and professional management, and people get taken care of really well. So we come from institutional roots, which I talk a little bit about in the book. And I think, we have an odd backstory in that, my clients really, after my first initial, cold calling in the World Trade Center, one of my first large clients was a not-for-profit at Cornell University on the campus there. Another, not the major Cornell endowment, but another one. And once I started working with that client, I just decided I love that business. So we have institutional roots. The business is completely different now. It used to be 70% institutions and 30% families, or private wealth, or high net worth, ultra high net worth. And now it's kind of the inverse of that. We're more family offices, ultra wealthy, high net worth. And then we still do a fair amount of institutional work. It's just kind of inverted somewhat. So
well, it sounds like a great firm to work with and to be a client of, and all those decades of work being paid off and paid to the next generation, which is great.
Yeah, I hope so. I think they're terrific, and people see me a lot and see my face, but there's so many people that do everything day by day and do a great job at it, and I'm very lucky.
Yeah. Well, the book is called Running with Grace. And where can we find it? Pretty much everywhere, right? Amazon.
Yeah, Barnes and Noble,
Noble.
Amazon.
Yeah.
If you do pick it up on Amazon, or Jeff, if you do send it out, I just encourage people. I'm all about feedback. I hope you go out on Amazon and write a review. But you can see there are a bunch of reviews out there.
Yeah, the reviews are great, as they should be. And for those of you that are listening to this call, we'll get you your complimentary copy as well. So thanks so much, Lori, for coming on the show today. And we look forward to seeing you next time.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I really appreciated it.
Yeah.